Hello, everyone. This is Jamarl Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, I have with me one of my favorite guests, easily, hands down, Professor Richard Wolff from Democracy at Work. Professor, welcome to the show.
Welcome. Thank you, Jamarl. For me, it's a pleasure to talk with you each time.
Like I said, you're always one of my favorite guests, and the audience always loves you when you come on to the show. So you're on the show because I was watching. I came across this article, and I read this article for the show itself. And my audience, well, I was not alone in being enamored with this, or let's say shocked by this. And essentially, it was stats by the Federal Reserve. Now, it's the Federal Reserve itself. It's not, some lefty socialist magazine that's coming out with these numbers. It is the Federal Reserve that's coming out with these numbers. I stress that. And the interesting thing, it says the bottom 50% of households in America own 1% of the wealth. The top 10% own 70% of the wealth, and the top 1% owns 31% of the wealth. And, when you think of wealth, that's not just wealth, that's also power, that's political influence. But the thing is, 50% of the population, the cooks, the cleaners, the haberdashers, the people who literally make this society work, own 1% of the wealth. How does that happen? And I'm asking you this because you have an interesting perspective on this. You have you're a Marxist. Well, to be honest, you have a economics education in the top schools, in this country, but also you have an added education of a Marxist perspective of this. And I think that is probably one of the most informed perspectives, because I find that Marxism has a really good way of analyzing capitalism. How do you explain this?
Well, the first thing is to say that things have been like this pretty much the history of the capitalist economic system that we live under. Sometimes when people get angry enough and upset enough about the inequality whose numbers you just provided, there is a movement backwards. And in other words, away from the gross inequality to at least less inequality.
Let me interrupt just for 1 second. Even if people they look at this and they say, look, it's a capitalistic system. We're in the system. And for the most part, people do relatively decent in this system, even if they look at it that way. I mean, even if you look at it from the standpoint of people play by the rules within the context of the system. When you look at this, don't you at least say a system shouldn't appropriate it this way? Like, yes, these people play by the rules. These people got $1 billion within the context of the system. But why do you have a system that appropriates wealth in this way? Why don't they see it that way? I mean, we see it that way. How do they miss that? I guess that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I think they're sitting in the pretty place. They're getting the disproportionate amount, and they don't want anyone to mess with that. So they have a vested interest, the people at the top, to do everything in their power, and they have a lot of power, to use their enormous wealth to preserve it, to protect it. And one of the ways you do that is you convince the mass of people either that there isn't the inequality that there obviously is, or if you can't do that, that you convince them that that inequality is somehow reasonable, is somehow appropriate, is somehow just. That takes a lot of work. You need a lot of professors, a lot of teachers, a lot of politicians, a lot of ministers and priests and rabbis to keep hammering that at the people, because it is so opposite to what they can actually see all around them. We all know which part of town the rich people live, and we all know in which part of town the poor people live. And we all know where the in-between, we all know. There's no mystery about it. So either you deny it to yourself, a lot of Americans do that. When you point out those numbers, the reason a lot of Americans are shocked is because they have been denying to themselves what some part of them really does know. But the other part of the story is the rationalization, the justification, the attempt for those who now see how unequal things are, the attempt is made to justify it. Look, in the history of the human race, pharaohs, 1,000 years ago in Egypt, they explained why they were billionaires of their time and everybody else was poor by saying that the God they believed in wanted it that way. Okay, if you can get a mass of people to believe that, you're safe, you're home free. And they spent a lot of money on a lot of temples and a lot of people dressed in very impressive robes, telling everybody that that's what God wanted. And there are still people, by the way, who believe that, who think that it's not their job to question or change whatever they find around themselves, because if it wasn't supposed to be that way, well, then God would have done something about it long ago. So, in economics curriculums, we tell a different kind of story, although our function is very similar to those in the religious outfits. We give people, our students, the idea that the rich people are rich because of something extraordinary they did, or some contribution to our well-being they made, or some invention they came up with. Very enormous effort to make it seem as though the people who are super rich deserve it. It's a very hard effort to make, because of course, it's one thing to say that the inventor of something new deserves a reward, which I don't find a problem. Sure, if you want to give a reward, give a reward. Let's take Jeffrey Bezos, the chief executive of the Amazon Corporation. What is his contribution to modern society? Well, let's take it as an example. He's a delivery boy who makes deliveries faster than other people used to be able to do. I'm very impressed. I appreciate fast delivery, and I appreciate that Jeffrey Bezos worked out a way to deliver junk to my house faster than other people used to do it. But if you ask me, does that justify the fact that he's the richest man on earth, that he owns in excess of $135 billion, which is more money than some countries have, that he earns on that money billions a year without any labor that he has to do at all? If you ask me, does the fact that he's a fast delivery boy justify those things? No. I think we could reward him for his speedy delivery, give him a very nice watch, give him a very nice car. I'm all for it. And give him the Medal of Honor for speedy delivery. But to take the money of millions of Americans who need it in order to make him richer than a pharaoh, I find that obscene. But that's how capitalism works. But I think if most Americans spent a little bit of time thinking about this, they would in fact find it not only unacceptable, but downright disgusting.
It's astonishing, though. I mean, you're making an extraordinarily good point. Jeff Bezos, I don't think anybody on this planet, in this country, anyone, I mean, regardless of their political leanings, would say, dude, you created a really good company and you can get these items to people really fast. You should get a reward for it. But the question becomes, should the reward be infinite, especially if the amount that he gets rewarded detracts from the amount of money that people have either in their pockets or that governments have from the standpoint of delivering services? It's like, should Jeff Bezos be $150 billion or should people be homeless? I would take those people not being homeless as opposed to him having $150 billion. But I think people look at it. I think you're right. They are born and raised. They are born and they die within the context of a system. And everything that they know from the time that they're born to the time that they drop dead is capitalism is awesome. This is the greatest system on the planet. Nothing else works. This is imposed by God. This is natural. I think you're right. If that's all that you know, then that you just look at the world through that lens. And maybe you don't question the larger things of, should a system appropriate wealth in this particular way?
By the way, I think you're right on target. I think you might make the point this way as yet another approach to it. People who lived in slavery for a long time, many of them believed that it was the best system, the only system, the natural system, the God-given system. A lot of the people in slavery felt that there was something natural, that some people were just naturally masters and other people were just naturally slaves. And they grew up in that system and they learned that, and many of them didn't question it until they did. And the same thing is true of feudalism with lords and serfs. So we shouldn't be surprised that in capitalism, at least as long as the system lasts, one of the reasons it lasts is that it can sell the idea that it's the bestest, it's the greatest, it's the natural, it's the culmination of human history. We can't do better. Look, we know we can do better than slavery because we've done it. We know we can do better than feudalism because we did it. Why we should think that we can't do better than capitalism is the weird point of view.
That's right there, because you're making a really good point. So if people can look back and they say, even through history classes, there were kings and queens, and people thought those kings and kings were appointed by God.
Right.
And then you can look back and you can say, well, people at the time in slavery just thought this was the way things were. And in all of those cases, they analyze those things as if they are a system. And yet the current system to which they are in, they never kind of make the disparity between those two things. Let me ask you this.